بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We're talking about Jalaluddin Rumi, and he was a famous poet who wrote in Persian. There is another Rumi, and he wrote primarily in Arabic, or almost exclusively in Arabic, which is why I've got there Rumi and Ar-Rumi. So scholars make the distinction between Rumi, the Persian, from Rumi, the Arab. They're both poets. Rumi, we'll talk about this at length, but Ar-Rumi, the Arab poet, is as unknown in South Asia and Persia as Rumi, the Persian poet, is unknown in the Arab world. There are poems of Rumi that have been sung by prominent Egyptian singers, like Kulthum, for instance. But for the most part, Rumi is unknown. So we'll be talking about that. But he's an enigmatic person in terms of his biography. His in the field of medicine, there are some scholars who stand out, and if you belong to the field of medicine, then you would know them. I would not know them. Then you have someone who is globally recognized, Muhammad Ali, for instance. So one would imagine that Rumi would fall into the second category, but he's not in that category. And we're trying to unpack that tonight and ask why Rumi is so well known in the West and so unknown in the Muslim world. How well known is Rumi in the West? According to some reports, Rumi is, I hesitate to actually share this with you because it's hard to believe that this is true. Rumi is the most popular poet in the Western world. The most popular poet in the Western world. It is striking that someone who is so popular is unknown in the Muslim world. Jalaluddin Rumi was born in Balkh, in that otherwise sad part of the Muslim world today. Inshallah, may Allah, help those people improve their condition. They've been victims of war for the past 40-odd years, and there seems to be no light at the end of their tunnel. And I'm talking about Afghanistan. Afghanistan has produced giants. So one of the great philosopher thinkers of Islam by the name of Imam al-Ghazali was also Afghani. One of the great Imams of fiqh, Abu Hanifa, was also Afghani. So Afghanistan has produced some giants. So he was born there. And he grew up in a traditional Muslim home. His father was an alim. And so he was given Islamic education. It's important to remember these things. And he then went to Syria, and he got his education in Islamic studies at Syria. According to some scholars, Rumi was actually Hafiz al-Quran. It's also very important to remember that. So you have someone who is of a traditional Muslim background, and then he goes out to get formally educated in Islamic studies. He memorizes the Quran and then lives a normal life. By that I mean, probably being the imam of a masjid and teaching people reading and writing. He was into what I am into, which is scriptural studies. You study the text and you analyze it and you compare it and you share it. That's basically what scholars do. That's what they do. And they sometimes get deluded into believing, except me, of course, I'm never deluded, except that then they get deluded into believing that they've actually reached the core of any particular issue. So that's also important, that your scholarship deludes you into believing that because you've read so well, because you have acquired so much knowledge on a particular issue, that you understand that issue in and out, until someone slaps you. So his moment of slap came when he met a person called Shams Tabriz. And he was around 37 years old at the time. And this is not a hadith, these are stories, so we don't know how factual they are. But they make for good conversation, so indulge me. It is, according to this report, Rumi met Shams Tabriz, and then Shams Tabriz was just an average human being. He must have been someone who did some kind of menial work. And so he goes up to Rumi and he asks him, Rumi was sitting and studying, and he asks Rumi, what are you doing? Gist. What is this stuff you? He says, it's books, you wouldn't know anything about it. So he said, okay. Then Rumi went off to do whatever he was doing, and the books were lying there. So he picked up the book and he threw it in the well. And there are no Barnes and Noble at that time. If somebody throws a book that's been all books were handwritten, so if somebody does that, you've lost something that's irreplaceable. He comes back and Rumi is furious. Rumi is furious. He says, what's wrong with you? Given who that person is, somebody who is an average worker, a char person, says, you obviously have no respect for knowledge. So he says, well, what's the problem? He says, where's my book? So he puts it in there and takes it out and gives it to him and says, here's your book. And the thing that shocks Rumi is that the book was actually intact. The book had no runs in it. You know what happens if you have, especially something written in ink, it's going to run, right? It didn't run. And that shocked him, Rumi. And he says, what is this? So Shams then just took his words and gave it back to Rumi. He said, what do you know about what this is? The very same response that Rumi gave Shams Tabriz gave it back to him. And that shocked him. And he says, what is this? And that began Rumi's journey. And he spent many years in the company of Shams Tabriz. And Shams Tabriz taught him everything there is to know about ultimate reality, getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and coming to terms with human beings and your everyday life. And those are not easy things to do. So for 3 years, Shams spent with him. Rumi imbibed everything that he could from Shams. Now, it must be said that in this kind of a relationship between the Shaykh and his murid, these are Sufis, so the relationship is between a master and a disciple. The relationship is not the relationship between you and I, for instance. It's spiritual, it's intimate, it's emotional, it's psychological. They connect at multiple levels. They connect at multiple levels. So it's beyond the kind of relationship that a teacher normally has with a student. And then Shams dies. According to some reports, Rumi's son actually killed him. We don't know if that's true or not. Because Rumi's son was envious of the relationship between master and disciple. It was so deep. But that set Rumi off onto his journey that gave us all the books that we have in front of us. So for the next 30 years of his life, Rumi spent every living moment writing about three items. or three objectives. One was Shams Tabriz. The other was the Prophet ﷺ, and of course, ultimately, Allah Himself. That's what he wrote about. So all of his writings revolve around these three themes. These are the major themes of Shams's life. That's all he of Rumi's life. That's all he focuses on. And then he dies, and he is buried in Konya. If you had the occasion to visit Konya, you have mixed feelings about going to the shrine itself, because it's probably the most secularized shrine of any saint in the entire Muslim world. It's like a museum piece. You know, you go into a museum and you say, well, these are the dinosaurs and so on. So there's nothing spiritual about it. There's nothing spiritual about it. And it's important to remember that as well. Very important to remember that. Because what that has done, and this is primarily because of what happened in Turkey after the fall of the caliphate and the rise of Ataturk, and he presented Turkey with a very drastic kind of secularism that suppressed religion greatly, particularly Sufi religion. So the upside of that was that the West was able to embrace Rumi. And we abandoned Rumi. So that moment in Turkish history is what determined what the shrine of Rumi would be like. I spent 2 or 3 days at the shrine. And there's a very nice, has anyone gone there? There's a very nice cemetery behind it. Very nice cemetery behind it. So if you want to charge your spiritual battery, then you should go out there. Obviously, if you spend the time at Rumi's shrine, then you would also get it. But it's devoid of what you and I would generally consider spiritual elements. It's like you're going to visit the Topkapi Museum. So this basically, in a nutshell, is the biography of Rumi himself. Now we move on to Rumi in the West. Rumi in the West is so big. Anyone here of Coldplay? Chris Martin? Well, Chris Martin was getting divorced from Gwyneth Paltrow. We know some things, And obviously a divorce is a traumatic event, right? So somebody bought him a book and gave it to him. And they gave him Rumi. And he said, it changed my life. It changed my life. Rumi changed my life. Madonna, she has included Rumi into her lyrics. She's Kabbalist. She's got this Judaic spirituality that she inclines towards, what you would call Jewish Sufism. But she also incorporates elements of Rumi. So there are many prominent Westerners who have accepted Rumi, have brought Rumi into their lives, have included Rumi into their music, into their art, into their culture, at a time when we have absolutely no idea who Rumi is. This is a very strange relationship here between an individual, which underscores the two opposing perspectives that are out there. In a sense, if you spend more, I wouldn't be able to cover all of that today or tonight, but if you spend enough time just on this one individual, who two groups one looks away towards him and the other one turns away from him, it tells you the story about Islam, it tells you about the story of the West, all of that. I'll try and help you and give you some material that you can focus on, and then you can build on that. But Rumi is very important for that. And this was not always the case. Except for the Middle East, the Arab world, Rumi was alien to the Arab world throughout the history of Rumi and the Arab world. But in the Muslim world, Rumi was not that. In the 17th, 18th centuries, Rumi was being accepted at a time when Islam was being rejected. This thing that you call Islamophobia, there's an element to Islamophobia that I want to bring your attention to. Islamophobia is not something that came out of the World Trade Center. If you want to be an educated Muslim about history, you must understand Islamophobia goes way back. And the reason we use the term Islamophobia because we are, at the present moment, we are an oppressed community and a depressed community. Because we're depressed psychologically, financially, in every way, we become easy targets for everyone else. But the point at which people started to demonize Islam and embrace Rumi, that turning point actually happens around the 17th century. When Europe is being enlightened, when the Industrial Revolution is beginning, but the threat of Islam lurks right there. Up to the 17th century, the most powerful religious community in the world was not Christians. You must remember that. It was Muslims. So the images that the West created of Muslims was because the West at that time had been living for about 700 years as depressed and oppressed. You get it now? Up to the 17th century or the 18th century, it was the Western world that was depressed because it was, and therefore it was oppressed. I don't want to go too far into this, but think about it. In the year 711, we went right across the Mediterranean, got into France, into Spain, got right up to the mountains there, what's it called, the Pyrenees, and we ran out of provisions and decided not to cross the Pyrenees. If we crossed the Pyrenees, what would we have colonized? France itself. The cultural epicenter of Western civilization. So this was a force to be reckoned with. We lay siege to Vienna twice. But because our headquarters was in Istanbul, getting from Istanbul to Vienna required a great deal of resources. You know how long it takes for the US, whenever it wants to bomb us, to get all their resources ready and take it to the Middle East. You have to prep for that for 8 to 10 months. And you have modern means of communication and transportation. You see what I'm saying? So for Suleiman to take his forces and go all the way to Vienna, he laid siege to Vienna twice and failed. And every time I teach this, I teach this class at university. Every time I do it, you can see this look of regret on the part of Muslim faces. God, why didn't you just capture Vienna? What is wrong with you? I kid you not, whenever I teach this thing, people say, man, Vienna, Austria, right there. There was nothing in Vienna for us. That's the point. You're looking at a Vienna that is now, it's a citadel of Western culture, civilization, music, and all stuff. At that point, he says, man, all these resources, who's going to go there? So Islam was the dominant force at this time when the transition towards Rumi is taking place in Europe, and Muslims are being demonized. From the 12th century to the 17th, 18th century, in the areas that are known as Iran and Turan. Iran is the area that you know right now, but that includes part of Iraq and so on. That's Iran. Iran is much bigger than modern Iran. Turan is the areas north of Iran. So Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all of those areas, that's Turan. There were two dominant scholars in those parts of the world. One of them you've become quite familiar with thanks to Ertugrul. Two scholars dominated that entire part of the world as well as what is today Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. One of them was a scholar known as Ibn Arabi. And Ibn Arabi is depicted in Ertugrul, if you saw it. and the other was Rumi. They were dominant for 5 centuries. They saw Islam and they saw the world through the eyes of Ibn Arabi and Rumi. Ibn Arabi was a philosopher, Rumi was a poet. Ibn Arabi was a philosopher, Rumi was a poet. And every Muslim would understand his Islam by way of, like today, I'm jumping about back and forth. Today, everybody is understanding Islam through hadith and Quran, but mainly hadith, because we're living in different times. So when you listen to a khutbah, you must look at the subtext of the khutbah, and you would notice that there's not much poetry here, unless you end up in some place where poetry is, they're giving it in Urdu or Farsi or something like that. There's not much focus on poetry. You have to validate what you're saying by way of hadith. In those 5 centuries, you had to illustrate what you say. You don't have to validate it. You have to express it. You have to show it by way of Rumi's imagery. You have to express it by way of Rumi's imagery. And so for 500 years, this is how Muslims looked at Islam and the world. At a huge cost, by the way, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So you understand how important these 2 people were, right? Most Orthodox scholars, most Orthodox have a huge problem with Ibn Arabi. And they don't have much nice to say about Rumi as well. And I'll explain that to you as well. So coming back to the West, Rumi had been translated by prominent Western scholars. He was translated by a guy called J. Aubrey. And Aubrey translated it to the best of his ability from Farsi into English. And then another poet by the name of Robert Bly. Anyone heard Bly's poetry? So Bly ran into Coleman Barks. And Bly told Barks, do me a favor, this poetry that this guy has translated is in a cage. Free it. The poetry that, what was his name again? Who translated it from Farsi into English, Aubrey. Bly didn't like the translation because it's shackled. He wanted to unshackle it. So he tells Coleman Barks, unshackle this thing. And it is through the efforts of Coleman Barks that Rumi has become today the most popular poet in the Western world. Coleman Barks. So if you go to a bookstore, you look at Rumi, you will find Barks' translation is there. Now, Barks doesn't know a word of Farsi. Okay, and he admits to that. He admits to that. And he says, all I did was I listened to Bly. Bly told me, take the translation of Aubrey and unshackle it, open it. So I did that. I didn't have to go to the original. Although any scholar worthy of his respect would say, I should try to understand some Farsi at least. He didn't do that. That's the one thing about Barks you must remember. The other is that Barks made a concerted effort to strip all imagery and reference to Islam from Rumi's poetry. So if you look at Barks' translation, you will find there isn't much reference to Quran or to Hadith or to the Prophet. Sometimes it comes in. But Rumi also makes references to the Bible, the Torah, and the Gospels. That is in there. Now you understand why it appeals to the Western mind. Because it has been appropriately sanitized. But I kid you not. I mean, if you can read the Quran, and I open up a Rumi the Rumi's original here, and I tell you to go through it, you will be picking up verses of the Quran every second line. Only because you know it's Quran. You may not, I'm not saying you have to be Hafiz, but because you listen to the Quran a lot, you say, hey, that looks familiar. That looks familiar. That looks familiar. That looks familiar. You understand? So you see what a striking transformation has taken place here. Rumi's book has been described in the following way. He says, Masnawiya, Maulawiya, Ma'nawi, Hasta Quran Dar Zabane Farsi. He said this tome of wisdom of the Maulana, this Masnawi, written in the couplets, Hasta Quran Dar Zabane Farsi, is nothing but the Quran in the Persian language. Is nothing but the Quran in the Persian language. Bach stripped the entire text of that. He stripped the Quran of that. And the book sold like hotcakes. I'm not faulting him for that. I'm telling you that we have the reason I thought this particular program, this class is important is, first of all, it's educational, hopefully, but it also hopefully will help us understand the way forward. He makes references to the Prophet, he makes references to the Quran, he makes references to Hadith. He says in one place, he says, this is nothing but what is within the Quran and within the Quran and within the Quran. He said, this is all it is. This whole, every chapter here is nothing but that. It's just the Quran itself. Just the Quran itself. If you understand the text and you look at the verse light in that way, then you say, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. You can see it. But it's not a translation of the Quran. It's not that. If you're looking at Farsi and you're looking at Arabic, you say, no. He goes way beyond that. Which is what makes it so attractive to people who want to understand Islam beyond just the written word. So when we say for 500 years, it had actually captured the imagination of the greatest scholars of the Muslim world. The greatest scholars. They are the commentaries on Rumi. They run into multiple volumes. And from the strangest of peoples, generally when you think about Deobandis, you don't think about this kind of Islam. I had when I was here, I used to have the Khalid Masnawi. Khalid meaning key. The key to the Masnawi. And it was in 14 or 15 volumes. This is also testimony to this individual who I'm talking about now, his encyclopedic knowledge. Because he's the same scholar who wrote Beheshti Zewar, Maulana Thanvi. So everyone knows Thanvi for having written Beheshti Zewar, which was like a small little book on how women should comport themselves in a modern world, right? And he wrote this 14 volumes on a commentary on Rumi. Rumi was read at every town in Turkey for decades, if not centuries. When I say that Islam was understood through the eyes of these two people, one of them Rumi and the other one Ibn Arabi, I kid you not. So they had a massive impact on us. If that understanding of Rumi was presented in Bach's translation, it would not sell. It would not sell. What the West is looking for is not a comparative breakdown of what Muslims believe in about Jesus and what Christians believe in about Jesus, what Muslims believe in about the Quran, what Christians believe in. In other words, the traditional comparative analysis and lecture about Islam and Christianity. The kind of dawah that is very popular in the Muslim world and in the West. This they find very attractive. Because on the one hand, it's very difficult for a Christian, particularly a white American Christian, to accept anything that is valuable from the Muslim world. They have a very negative attitude towards us. And for them to suddenly embrace this tells you that if you strip it of its characteristics, it will sell. So what is it in Rumi that they find so attractive? And what is it in Rumi that we abandoned? Rumi does 2 or 3 things that the Western mind finds very attractive. Rumi inserts the spiritual with a very light touch. When Rumi speaks about the spiritual, when he speaks about God, when he speaks about the other world, he does so in a way that attracts the Western mind. It's very important to know that. Because if you want to present Islam to a Western mind, you will have to at least use that approach. I'm not asking you to strip Islam of its characteristics and give it to the people outside the way in which Coleman Barks did. That's what I'm saying. But here's what we do. We use the theological approach. You have to prove to them that there's only one God. The Trinity is wrong. You've lost the argument right there. In the heart of heart, they know the Trinity is wrong. They know it's wrong. When you do that, you're simply humiliating them. It's not something that they would find acceptable. Some of them change when they accept that the Trinity is wrong. But our point of entry into a conversation is that the Trinity is wrong, or that Jesus was just a human being, and so on. They're looking for answers they're looking for a way of life or a global perspective that would satisfy their needs. And they're not grappling with the Trinity. They're grappling with the world outside them. They're trying to come to terms with the world outside them. The human mind and the human body and the human psyche is, I don't know what the speed is, but let's just assume it's designed to drive or move at a speed of, say, 60 miles per hour. And human progress is moving at a speed of 300 miles per hour. That's the challenge we all face as human beings. Life is moving, and you guys in medicine, it's just mind-boggling. When you took off in medicine and you started studying, how much of that has become dated already? Ask yourself. Well, thank God the human body still has so many bones and so many muscles and all the rest of it. But in terms of medication, in terms of treatment, and what was yesterday is not today and will not be tomorrow. That creates its own angst. It puts a whole pressure on you. So when Western minds gravitate towards that, they find answers in there. They find answers in there. Unfortunately, I don't have my Rumi with me, and I don't have the expertise to read the Rumi that is without the translation. I've got one that has both the Urdu and the Farsi, which helps me understand it. So I can't share you need an actual class to just sit down and say, who is Rumi? What does he say? He says some fascinating things. He says fan is fascinating, and people love that. We don't. And here's why. At the time when the West is starting to be attracted to Rumi, is a time when our wheels start to come off. The empires that we had built, the Sasanian Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, were all crash landing. They were all crash landing. And the problem for us was two. The smaller problem was that we were now being dominated by the West. But the bigger problem that we still cannot come to terms with is how do you live life as a dominated nation? That is a huge challenge for us. You'll be, surprised to learn this, some of you I think. Hindus in India have always lived lives of being dominated. This is their moment of domination. So you can look at Modi and the RSS and all the rest of them as demons, and perhaps because of what they're doing, that is right. But in the broad scheme of things, Hindus are saying this is the first time in our history, the first time in our history when we determine our own destiny. And Muslims are saying after the 18th century, this is the first time in our history when someone else is determining our destinies. Yet, our wheels come off, our entire world comes crashing down. And we have worked. I ask you, think about yourself in this country 30 years ago. And ask yourself, what kind of khutbahs were you listening to 30 years ago? And I'll kind of jog your memory. All of the khutbahs generally came back to the same idea that if we do this, inshallah, we will regain our glory. If you're old enough, then you would know that this was a common theme of all the khutbahs. You went to an ISNA conference in the early 70s or late 70s, they would all be talking about that. Muslim glory, Muslim glory, Muslim glory. We don't talk about that too often now. We now talk about coming to terms with life in the modern world. But the reason for that is because we had 1,000 years of global dominance. And part of the reason that the wheels came off was because of these two people, Rumi and Ibn Arabi. Because Rumi and Ibn Arabi were giving us a mindset that allowed us to come to terms with the world that said, you should basically, to use a colloquial term, you should chill. You have an empire, the empire takes care of you, your borders are protected, you have a fairly decent standard of living, you need make no progress. You need make no progress. And these two gentlemen showed us how to live the good life. Where the first college was established in Calcutta to teach engineering or something like that, which was the forerunner to the triple IT or IITs in India right now, the Indian Institute of Technology, the forerunner to that. There were 42 people who registered. 2 of them were Muslim. 2 of them were Muslim. Muslims couldn't see the value of engineering and science. So obviously, you're having that Vienna moment. Let's call it that. You know the Vienna moment? You say, oh my God, really? I mean, couldn't you see that the world is going to be technologically driven? And science is going to become the new template upon which all civilization will be based? For God's sake, why don't you register? You're still running this country. You're still running this country. And what's his name? Shah Zafar, what's his name? Bahadur Shah Zafar was still in power. So to all intents and purposes, you still control India. Like you've been controlling in the 15th century, the 14th century, 13th century, and so on. Since the year 1207, when the Delhi Sultanate was first established, you knew no other world. You knew no other world, so you lived under this cloud of dominance, control, superiority. It's a kind of delusion, it's a kind of intoxication that it takes centuries to get out of it. So we had no need to worry about where religious leadership came from. The ulama were there, the Europeans come in, they dismantle the entire structure. Now you have to think about new leadership. We had Islamic law that determined how we should live our lives. Islamic law went out the window. Our means of earning a living went out the window. We used to get these monthly stipends from the government. That went out the window. So you understand that entire world is crashing. You have no time for Rumi here. You have no time for Rumi here. You only have time for three things: roti, kapra, and there we go. House, bread, and clothing. Basic human requirements. You don't have time to worry about how the world should be viewed with, Rumi was someone who was inclusive. He was an amazing human being, brilliant. He looked at humanity as being one. We looked at humanity as being at least two. We, the dominators, and the rest of humanity, the dominated. You can understand it? I mean, it's your empire after all. How are you going to see yourself? If it's your empire, you're going to see yourself as Tekadar, as the one in charge. And everyone else was just obeisance to you. Said, okay, So that mindset had to change. That mindset had to change. Rumi understood already 800 years ago, and it had nothing to do with politics. He just looked at the Quran, where we looked at the verses that spoke about Muslim dominance. He saw the world, the world as being part of a collectivity of creatures. For Rumi, a rat was no better or worse than a human being. A gnat was no better than worse than a human being. A squirrel, a sparrow, they're all khalqullah. They're all the creatures of Allah. Now you understand why the West find them so attractive. He was an environmentalist when environmentalism was unknown entirely. Because his entire approach to life was different. Our approach was imperial, authoritarian, exclusive, controlling. His was inclusive. It was flat. He saw no superior, no inferior. The only superior he saw was Allah. And he did that through the Quran. We need a tremendous amount of information to get to where he did. Because for us, it's easy to jump to one particular verse. It says, Allah tells us we are the dominating community in the world. He said, you're looking at one verse that says that we are supposed to dominate the world, and the rest of the 700 verses out there that say you have to treat all other creatures as equal. So we have not been paying attention to Rumi because our situation changed. So look at the movement I'll end now. The movement that developed at that time, around the 17th, 18th century. You had a movement that developed in places like in West Africa. There was a scholar they called Uthman Danfodio. There was a scholar in India called Shah Waliullah Dehlawi. And later on, there was a scholar in Egypt who came from Iran, and so his name was Jamaluddin Afghani. They spoke about giving back life to the Muslim world, stripping Islam of all its unnecessary baggage that was brought into Islam because of the teachings of these two. If everyone is the same, if all creatures are the same, if all human beings are the same, what difference does it make whether you make salah in the masjid or you make salah or you make your prayer in the... You see that when you say equality, it means it's a package. Everything comes with it. You can't simply say we're all human beings and then draw the line and say, okay, but as far as praying is concerned, you pray where you are and I pray where I am. No. It creates that kind of communality. It creates that communality. So these scholars stood up, and of course the most demonized is the Arabian scholar called Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab came as a direct reaction to this idea that anything goes. Then you had these Islamic movements like the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan and India, and the Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt. They're not interested in going back to what Rumi had to say. They're looking at how do you bring Muslims into the 20th century? How do you modernize Islam? How do you save this community? Then you had the secularists, a small group of secularists, very powerful people. They went on to become presidents of countries. Sukarno in Indonesia. Then you had Ayub Khan, and all of these guys were interested in creating a secular state in which everyone could live in relative harmony, and Islam would be a religion amongst other religions. So these were the big players at this time, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century. So they had no time to worry about Rumi. The West, on the other hand, was moving rapidly towards materialism. Christianity was crumbling. Religion itself was looked at as a stumbling block to human development. But the soul, human soul, whether it was Christian, Hindu, or Jewish, still needed some relief. And that's why Rumi became so popular in the West. Jazakumullah, if you have any questions, you can ask them. Yeah.
So, how would you compare Muhammad Iqbal and Rumi? Throughout the lecture, I was trying to compare, both of them. Looks like there were some similarities but lots of differences between both people's approach. Our crowd is though Iqbal and not Rumi. So, how would you summarize both people?
Well, I'm not someone who is generally humble, but I'll humble myself here. I don't think I know enough to compare Iqbal to Rumi. And I say this because they're both giants. I know that much. Iqbal, I'm going to guess here, taking a chance. Iqbal is probably as profound as Rumi. Iqbal, I think, is as profound as Rumi. Iqbal is formally educated in Western studies. He has a deep understanding of Western philosophy. He was a student, not a direct student, but he had studied people like Nietzsche. So he understood things that were out. I'm just assuming. When I say I don't know this, I'm telling you where my dark areas are. I don't know how much Rumi knew about Greek philosophy, for instance, Aristotle and Plato and so on. But yeah, that's a good comparison. I think Iqbal I don't think he's too far behind Rumi.
But one of the main differences I noticed was Rumi, you said it was more like a Sufi guy, but Iqbal was
entirely Sufi. Entirely Sufi.
It was?
Yes. That's why he seems so contradictory. He says something here and then he says the opposite that side. That's because of the reality he's dealing with. So he was in the same way that Rumi was entirely Sufi, Iqbal was entirely Sufi. I don't mean the Piri, Muridi, Mazari Sufi. I'm talking about hardcore real Sufism. Iqbal was entirely Sufi. Yep.
The communality and the spirituality that the Rumi you were talking about that I was so appealing to the West, is that through the box translation or is the original version of Rumi?
No, that's box translation. That's Box's translation. But the important thing is that if we start looking at that more carefully, the box translation, and using that as your point of entry. You start with say, brother, read the Quran. I don't deny that many people have converted to Islam by reading the Quran, but as many people have said, I don't know what it says, it's so confusing. I've gotten both. There are people who've been enamored by it and people who've been left bamboozled by it. Given that so many Westerners gravitate towards Rumi, I think it behooves us as a community that wants to reach out, if not to convert, then at least to build bridges, that we use that as your platform. The reason we are not doing that is because it's something that's alien to us. We don't think in those terms. We think about, well, Christianity is wrong because of the Trinity, Islam is right because of the Tawheed, and so on. It becomes a comparative. Whereas if you say, well, the more I think about it, the more I think, maybe we're just not treating this patient rightly. We got medication, he said, this is what the patient needs. And it's not the doctor, what the doctor does. He has to find out what is wrong with this patient. I mean, right? That's your point of entry. What is wrong with this patient? And what has he been using that has kind of given him some, given him some relief? That becomes your point of entry. So the reason I've been focusing on Rumi myself personally for a while now is because I think even using Bach's, he's a very, very good point of entry. Westerners need things in Islam that we might not need.
So the original Rumi would have more of those talking points or the poetry from a perspective of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's what
But in a way that we would, that's why I told you that Muslim scholars are skeptical of Rumi. Because the way in which Rumi presents Allah is not the way in which they recognize him. The way in which he presents the Prophet ﷺ is not the way in which Muslim scholars recognize it. Now, those who are deeply endowed, they realize, okay, this is the true meaning of it. But I think an easy way is through the Bach's translation. Although most of my colleagues, they don't like the Bach's translation. He says, because you've colonized Rumi. There's a Muslim scholar there of Iranian stock. I think she's in Rutgers or at Yale. And she says, this is nothing but one more form of colonizing. You just colonize Rumi. You've taken whatever is ours and just stripped it of it. There is no mention of God in this thing. There's no reference to the Quran in it. And you've created a text but it appeals to the Western mind. And so half your work has been done. The challenge now is for you to take your own understanding of Rumi slightly deeper and take that into and engage in conversations. On the one hand, I generally know more than most people in this kind of environment about Islam. On the other hand, I don't have this kind of first-person contact that you have. I mean, you have to go to work every day. You have to meet your patients every day. You have to, and if you're looking beyond just how do I treat this patient, how do I handle this particular contract, and you're looking at the human thing, and you should always do that, by the way. Don't just look at a patient. There's more to a human being than just being a patient. There's more to a human being than just being a client. There's more to a human being than just being a customer. He says, well, what makes this person tick? And then it's a really good skill. And then you ask them 2 or 3 key questions. You don't have to ask them generally it's not a wise idea, at least in the West, ask them direct questions about religion and things like that. But you ask them questions that kind of prods them, and your own understanding of who Americans are, what they look, that's what you have to do. You have to find out who Americans are, what are they looking for, how can we help? What are they looking for and how can we help? It's a big challenge. We have to do a lot of work on it because for the most part we've been looking I think, in my humble opinion, we've been looking in the wrong direction, but I think it's a great place to start.
So you said it's a mystery, but the reason I came, I wanted to hear from you because we need to learn something and where from here to go to reach to that level.
You have to,
I know it's a big question, but
well, you have to familiar. I'm reluctant to do this, but I have to. You have to familiarize yourself with Rumi himself. There are some people who know Farsi. By the way, Hafiz Rabbani knows Farsi pretty well. So you might want to grab him and say, you know what, start up a Rumi class with us. And if you have your Urdu, then half your battle is won.
But you have the book translated, and then you have the book of...
No, I'm not going to teach you this stuff.
No, I'm going to get...
No, you don't use the translation. Get someone to teach you this stuff. It's a slow process. I mean, life is long, you know. Thanks to modern medicine and science, we now live longer lives, right? Except that what do we do with all the extra time that we have? Watch reruns. That's all we do. So instead of that, get into a program of where somebody can teach you some Rumi.
If you go to Punya, and then you will see a lot of decibels of Rumi, and they do the whirling dervish.
Yeah, that's commercial Rumi. That's not Rumi. I mean, if you want to go and see a show, that's okay. That's an insult to Rumi. Every time you see the whirling dervishes, that's an insult. That's not Rumi. It kind of looks funny and looks nice or whatever.
But that's the way they're spreading all over Turkey.
Yeah.
And could be responsible for spreading Rumi all around.
Maybe I'm not, but because when they talk Rumi, they talk about the whirling dervishes, one hand facing the sky, the other one facing the earth, and you're drawing this energy from the sky and connecting to the. No, that's not Rumi.
I just want to ask you, you mentioned you visited Rumi's shrine and you
Konya.
did not see any spirituality. What is spirituality?
The problem might be with me.
What is spirituality to you?
I answered that question for you. The problem might be with me. In other words, I think I qualified that when you go to a shrine, Muslim shrine, it has a particular ambiance to it. It might have incense stick burning. You might find people dressed in a particular way. Come on, all of you've gone to shrines, right? Rami? Right, so you know what a shrine, Rome is not like that. I mean, a whole bunch of Americans coming in, the tour buses just landed. I had my hotel was right across if you've gone there, they have the cheaper hotels, not like the one that you guys lived in. So right there, and you can see what's going on. Right there, and you can see the tour bus comes and people come in. Oh,
Isn't it one's own relationship to that person who viewed
that is you're talking about deep spirituality. But I'm talking about the atmosphere that you and I are generally, when you think about, let's just say you're from Iran and you go to a shrine, there's a certain ambiance to it that people would go there, somebody would be reading Quran, someone else would be making dhikr and so on, making dua. There's none of that there. You haven't? Have you been?
No,
Yeah, it's. I mean, those who've gone, they'll tell you it's like a museum.
I mean, is it related to Rumi stuff over
No, Rumi is buried right there.
No, I mean,
Yeah, his hat.
okay.
So his hat. There's some books there. His abaya.
Isn't that like, okay, psychological, okay, you have that in your mind, like, okay, has to be a certain way, maybe candles or Quran.
That's right.
But the spirituality
It's within you.
Right. It doesn't require that to have that ambiance to be spiritual.
It helps though.
That's what it is, like it's psychological.
Can I ask this question in Urdu? Maulana, फिसल तो नहीं गए थे?
Oh, did Rumi slip?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he slipped every day. Rumi slipped every day. But he said, that's life. He says, you have to slip. He didn't say this, but Rumi was all about slipping. Rumi was all about slipping. Rumi's, I mean, his stories are just amazing. It's amazing. Some of the best Western minds have just been blown away by him because he takes the simplest thing. He'll talk about the chair, for instance, or he'll talk about a leaf, and he would shock you with the perspective he puts on the leaf lying on the floor. He says, wow. Who would have thought that? Who would have thought that? There's a really nice one he has on chiseling. Chisel. And chiseling by itself is not a very comfortable endeavor, because you're grating. And then his catch line at the end is, how else do things get beautified? I mean, if I saw this documentary on the statue of David, right? By, what's his name? Michelangelo. wow, it was an amazing documentary. It was chiseling all the way. It was painful. It was messy. There was no fun about it. But what came out of that was David. You know the statue of David? It's a magnificent statue. That's Rumi's point. All right, inshallah. Thank you very much. Assalamu Alaikum.